Hello again, everybody. Welcome to another Toonkind RP Read Aloud. My name is Whis. I'm going to be reading for Chifley Forde today. I'm joined by my lovely Cursed Hymns buddies.
Hi, I'm Heartless, and I'll be reading for Gille Trebble.
Hello, I'm Mira, and I will be reading for Sammy Jax.
And this little roleplay takes place directly after the Flip the Script and Broken Heart Syndrome FPSs. If you haven't listened to those, there will be context you're missing. And there is some significant angst in this little story today, so do the self-care, be aware. All right, we'll get started then.
The scene comes back up on Gille's room with Gille and Sammy still kind of sitting on his bed. Gille looks up at Chifley and says, "So, Chifley, is it alright if I come over to your apartment?" Gille looks over to Sammy for a moment before looking back to the blue-haired Toon. He gives the other a smile, rubbing at the circles underneath his eyes that appeared there after he'd been so stupid again. Would rather be close enough to start making amends as fast as possible.
Chifley blinked at Gille. I don't mind, though it's not as... He motioned to Gille's room. Impressive as yours.
Sammy's head is bobbing a bit as he fights the urge to go back to sleep, his gold eyes half-lidded. Let's go home, Chif. He yawns, not even noticing his choice of words. Tired, and we get to have Gille with us. He sleepily brightens, shading going yellow at the idea before shifting back to a light muted gray-brown. Is good. Yes.
Chifley blushed a little. Easy, Sammy. If you fall asleep standing up, I won't be able to carry you.
Sammy whined a bit, rubbing at his eyes. I won't. He slaps his cheeks with his hands. I'm awake.
Gille looks over at Sammy with a slight frown before standing up himself. He leans down and sweeps the taller Toon up into his arms. Seemed like he had it for a moment before suddenly his shaking arm sent both him and the taller Toon to the ground in a heap. You know, that went worse than I expected. I could carry you if I wasn't so tired. He slowly extracted himself from the heap, brushing himself off. He looked over to Chifley, giving him a tired smile. I do not mind so much, as long as I don't have to sleep on the floor.
Sammy yelps at the motion, then bursts into a fit of sleepy giggles. I'm up! He is still, in fact, on the ground.
All right. Let's go. You're both exhausted. Chifley smiled. I can make dinner, Missy offered, who was standing quietly off to one side this whole time. Chifley put a hand on her head. We'll order a pizza.
Gille chuckled, leaning over to wrap his arms around Sammy. He lifted the taller Toon from the ground this time, although he mostly just stood him up on his feet. Sammy, I know you said you were tired, but I didn't realize you were this tired. I don't think I could carry you. You can lean on me, okay? The purple devil looked back at Chifley with a tired grin, his tail looping around behind him. Dinner sounds nice. I'm pretty hungry. I don't think I've had anything at all today.
Chifley sighed. What am I going to do with you two? He smiled a little and made for the door. Come on, then.
Sammy leans against Gille, practically melted against the smaller Toon. His steps are slow and dragging, and even though he tries, he's not very coordinated as the hours he'd spent awake over the last week were finally claiming him. I like both of you so much, Sammy sleepily declares. Missy, you're Nice. You're a good sister to Chif. Yes. His chin is nuzzled between Gil's horns, despite how much he's hunched over to do so, and looks rather content to just stay that way the entire way back to the Fords' apartment.
Luckily, it wasn't too far between their apartments, and there was a small pizza shop on the way for a 10-minute detour. Missy unlocked the door and let them into the apartment, so Chifley could keep both hands on the small stack of pizza boxes he had in his hands.
Gil nodded with a slight chuckle, gesturing for Chifley to lead the way. As they stepped out of the Chaos Fam's apartment, Purple Deviltoon reached into his pocket and pulled out a fox mask. He placed it on over his face before they left the building, carefully hiding his identity while they were out and about in public. He had to dip forward a couple of times with Sammy on top of his head, just to give himself a little bit of a break from the contact. He was very, very grateful when Missy opened the door, even reaching over and rustling her hair. He shakily pulled Sammy through the door, looking to the blue-haired Toon for some amount of direction. Sleepyhead up here needs to sit down again.
Sammy slowly peels himself off of Gil, quietly mumbling as he rubs his eyes. He blinks a few times, and then his shading brightens to a bright yellow. Home, 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 he quietly says in between a few yawns as he makes his way towards Chifley's couch, grabbing Gil's hand along the way and tugging him along.
Chifley put the pizza boxes on the coffee table. Missy, can you get some plates and cups of water, please? Okay, Chifley! And she scurried off. The main room of the apartment was still very sparse. A couch, an armchair, coffee table, and rug.
Gil didn't fight Sammy's pull, merely stumbling a little on his feet from the surprise. He blinked, reaching up with his other hand to take off the fox mask from his face. He managed to get his feet underneath him, looking back towards Chifley a little helplessly.
Chifley just smiled. Take a seat. The couch is pretty comfortable, he told him, setting out the boxes and opening them up, the smell of pizza wafting up from them. He wants to cuddle.
Only if wanna, Sammy yawned. His hand gently threading itself through Gil's before he flops down on the couch, nestling himself comfortably against the arm and back of the couch. He doesn't pull Gil down with him, just blinks sleepily up at Gil with shading that's a warm cream against porcelain white.
I think I lost her for hold on.
Sorry, what?
Oh, there it is. Okay. The Purple Deviltoon relaxed a little as Chifley smiled, slipping the fox mask into his pocket where it belonged. He blinked rapidly a few times at the words, slowly sitting down beside Sammy. Cuddle? But I'm pointy. That can't be very comfortable. Gil looked over to their joined hands for a moment, sinking back into the couch as he let out a sigh. He looked up at Sammy's face, lifting a single eyebrow. He became extremely mystified again, lifting his other hand to scratch at his cheek. If you want?
Missy came running back into the room, a stack of plates in her hands. She put them on the table. Chifley, can I have some of the pizza now? Chifley nodded. Yes, Missy, go ahead. Can I eat in my room? Chifley hesitated and blinked once, slowly. Sure. Yay! She loaded up a plate with a few slices of pizza and ran off, giggling.
You're sharp, but not fine, Sammy yawned. His sharp teeth were on display. I've slept on your person-shaped, and that means you're rounder than rocks. You're good. He nods to himself sleepily, but is always your choice. Don't wanna take away from either of you.
Gil looked back over towards Chifley as Missy came back into the room, observing that exchange with an even more mystified look on his face. He looked back to Sammy, lifting his unoccupied hand to his face to yawn. You've slept on rocks? Well, they are hard to sleep on. One of the reasons why I absolutely refuse to ever go camping again. He reaches up his hand to brush a piece of his hair behind his ear. How about I think about it? There's food to be had in the meantime, and I think we should both eat.
Sammy nods. Okay. He looks like he could fall asleep at any moment.
Chifley put a hand on Sammy's shoulder. Eat. Then you can both get some rest. He sat down on the floor on the other side of the coffee table. Goodness knows it's been a day.
Gil blinked slowly before looking behind the couch to where the plates and pizza were. He groaned a little before slipping his hand out of Sammy's grip. He dragged himself to his feet, dragging his shoes across the floor as he walked all the way over to the table. He grabbed a couple slices for himself before putting a couple on another plate. Then he dragged his feet all the way back to the couch. He shoved the other plate into the taller dude's grip before rudely plopping back down on the couch. He picked up one of the pizzas, folding it in his hands and daintily taking a bite. So, what was that about?
He tilted his head to one side. What was what about?
Gil waved the piece of pizza in his hand towards the direction that Missy went. That. He took another bite, raising an eyebrow at Chifley.
Missy?
Gil furrowed his eyebrows at Chifley, swallowing the food in his mouth. You know what I'm talking about. She asked to go eat in her room and ran off giggling. From my experience, children don't usually like eating in their rooms. So what was that about?
He blinked and turned to look at Missy's door for a long moment. I usually tell her no food in the bedrooms. He frowned a little. I can't hear anything.
Sammy has slowly started to eat his pizza that Gil had handed him, his head bobbing up and down sleepily as he chews. His mask is draped down around his neck, and he looks sleepy and content to just listen to his two boys talk. Slowly, the pizza disappears, and Sammy's head drops fully against the back of the couch, his golden eyes sliding closed as he snuggles firmly into the couch.
Gil glanced at Sammy for a moment before looking back to Chifley. He furrowed his brow, leaning slightly forward while taking another bite of his food. He swallowed this time before talking again. What do you mean you can't hear anything? Is this the background music again?
Chifley nodded. Yeah, I can't hear hers right now. He took a bite of his own food. Yours is the loudest, actually.
Gil thought about that for a moment before leaning back in where he was sitting. He ate more of the pizza in his hands before placing the plate down on his knees. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a handkerchief, wiping his hands off. He tilted his head to the side before placing the handkerchief back into his hairless face. Why would mine be the loudest right now? Is it because Sammy's pretty much asleep? What about yours?
Chifley nodded, finishing up his slice and taking a moment. Mine and Sammy's are still there. We primarily have string instruments in ours. They're still playing, but your melody is much more obvious. He glanced at Missy's door. Missy's theme sounds very different to anything that plays for the three of us.
He hummed, picking up the plate and putting it on the table in front of him. He leaned back again, pressing his head back against the couch. Gil folded his hands over his stomach, his tail flicking up and down beside him. Oh, well, I suppose that makes sense. Missy's a child, and all of us are adults. And I'm... well, I suppose I should probably stop saying that I'm the villain. He chuckles a little under his breath.
Chifley pulls his knees to his chest and folds his arms on them, resting his chin on his arms. You should, he said softly.
Gil lets out a sigh, letting his head rest back against the upper part of the couch. His pumpkin orange eyes dimmed, the dark bags under them looking larger. He rocked his head back and forth, his gaze flicking from Chifley to Sammy and back. It's hard to stop. I don't feel like an anti-hero. I don't even know what an anti-hero is supposed to do. At least being a villain means there's a handbook.
Chifley snorted tiredly. You could try not labeling yourself so strictly. He looked up at Gil and then pulled himself to his feet, moving as though he were wading through wet cement. Gil, you're exhausted.
Gil wrinkled his eyebrows together at that, reaching up to comb his fingers through his hair. But if I don't use a certain persona, how am I supposed to act? He looked up at Chifley, blinking again. He slowly nods, pulling his fingers through his hair. He rubbed at his eyes with 2 fingers, pushing up his glasses to reach them. You're right. I am exhausted. Should probably just head to bed. That being said, what is the sleeping arrangement?
How about you just act like you? At the mention of sleeping arrangements, Chifley looked at Gil for a moment, then over at the other bedroom door, opposite the one Missy had vanished behind. He swallowed. Well, my bed is through there. He rubbed at his arm. We have some bedrolls too, if needed.
Sammy sleepily flops his head towards the direction of Chifley and Gil. Wanna cuddle you both, he quietly mumbles, rubbing at his eyes.
Like me? Gil reached up, pressing against his chest for a moment as he considered that. He decided to shelve that for now, pushing it into the back of his thoughts. He slowly pushed up from the couch, glancing towards Sammy as he mumbles. Gil looked back to Chifley, raising his eyebrows at the mention of a bed. He rubs at his chest again, thinking of this predicament. Well, I'm not very tall, and I have what I wear to bed already with me. I would rather not sleep on a bedroll again if possible. Where's your bathroom? The purple devil looked to the blue-haired Toon, the most honestly lost look on his face.
The bathroom is through the door on the far right there. He pointed before looking down at Sammy. Well, the bed is probably big enough for all 3 of us.
There is a sleepily pleased look on Sammy's face, shading warm buttery gold and airbrushed rose, and his lips upturned in a smile.
Gil nodded and slowly started to make his way over to it, his pointed ears twitching up and down as Chifley talked behind him. He hadn't the slightest clue why the blue-haired Toon was talking in such a halting manner. It was just a bed, and there was enough room for all of them on it. He reached the door and opened it, slipping inside. He was only in there for a moment, before he came out again in a dark orange bathrobe and soft black pants. He didn't have an undershirt on, the white scar over his heart clearly visible. Alright, I'm ready. Oh, wait, I need to take off my glasses. He reached up and pulled them off his face, carefully examining them for a moment. They needed to be cleaned, but at least they didn't have any cracks. He folded them up and slipped them into a pocket on the fuzzy bathrobe.
Chifley's eyes locked onto that scar. Gil, that scar, he said softly.
Sammy's eyes open up fully and he straightens, his shading shifting back to a blue. Oh, Gil. He looks at Gil and then slowly stands up, looking hesitant. Can I hug you? He asks softly.
Gil blinks, as it's mentioned, looking down at it. He touches the edge of it, a slight red and blue static look coming to it for a moment. He pulls his hand away, the red and blue static retreating to the edges of the white. He takes the edges of his bathrobe and pulls them tighter around him, covering it a little more. It's fine. It's fine. It just looks like that right now because I went a little far today. He slowly starts to make his way towards the bedroom, pausing as Sammy stands up. He tiredly looks up at the tall Toon, tilting his head to the side. He looked confused, his eyebrows furrowing. Why?
Chifley frowns but goes to open his bedroom door, waiting for the other two in silence. His room is just as bare as the rest of the apartment, but the bed in the middle is a full king size and is dressed for the depths of winter.
Sammy looks at Gil and fidgets with his sleeves. I'd like to hug you. I know it's healed, but I'd like to hug you. You look like you might need it.
For the first time in his life, he feels caught in vulnerability. Not like before in Bond's office when he forced himself into it. Not like when he was younger, when he had no control over the situation. Gil felt utterly vulnerable as his nemesis asked that question, hands subconsciously reaching up and pressing over that scar, causing the white to fizzle, turning blue where he touched. He pressed against it for a moment, staring at Sammy. I'm just so tired. Can I have a hug, Sammy?
Sammy nods and with soft, quiet feet approaches Gil, pulling him into his arms and gently enveloping the smaller Toon. His hand reaches up to gently card through Gil's hair. He holds on for a long moment before pulling away slightly, keeping his arms loosely wrapped around Gil. He bends down to give Gil a kiss on the forehead. You can always have one from me, he quietly says. Let's get to bed. You look as tired as I feel.
You both look wretched, Chifley remarked. I'll tuck you both in if I have to. Come on.
Gil leans into it, letting his hand fall from his chest into his side. He lets out a long sigh, closing his eyes as he just feels the soft tugs. He didn't hug back, but he wasn't tense. He breathed in and out, focusing on how Sammy's clothing feels against his face and what he smells like. Growing things in dust after the rain had come. Petrichor. He opened his eyes and wobbled a little, but managed to continue to stand on his own as the taller Toon pulled away. His eyelashes fluttered as he looked up at Sammy, the rainbow hair falling all in his face. He made a vow then, quietly to himself. He would do everything in his power to keep this Toon safe, to make it so that Sammy would never have to go through what just happened again. He would sooner tear his own heart out and eat it. He cemented this in his mind as he slowly nodded, looking over to Chifley. I'm offended. I always look drop-dead gorgeous. I don't know what you're talking about. Gil's words didn't have the usual bite to them. No effort to pretend that he really meant any of those words. His tail curled around Sammy's leg as he moved, walking toward the blue-haired Toon.
Sammy's breath catches on an exhale as Gil's tail curls around his leg, and it takes a moment for Sammy to restart his brain enough to even think about following Gil and Chifley. He sighs quietly to himself, dreamily, as a few hearts float up to leave a trail behind him as he finally approaches. He reaches Chifley, who's waiting at the door, and opens up his arms, inviting Chifley to a hug as well.
Chifley steps forward into that hug before even thinking about it. gorgeous, and out of it enough that I could push you over, he said with a small giggle.
Sammy practically melts over Chifley, pressing a kiss to the shorter Toon's forehead as well. Thank you for being patient with us, Chif. He mumbles sleepily into Chifley's blue hair.
Chifley just smiled, blinking slowly up at Sammy very fondly. You're welcome. He gave a nudge towards the bed. Bed. I can play with your hair, if you like, until you fall asleep.
That would be nice, Sammy sleepily says easily, following Chifley's guidance. This is an off switch. Prisma Mum says so, and I always want a nap when she does my hair. Comforting.
Gil made his way around Chifley, a low chuckle coming out of him as his tail moved to sinuously curl around one of the blue-haired Toon's legs. Careful what you say. Don't want to make a liar out of you. He yawned almost imperiously as he retreated to the bed, crawling onto it until he was completely on the left side. He burrowed underneath the covers, curling up as he waited for the other two to come over. His eyes were already shut, his pointed ears twitching at Sammy's sleepy words without really having the consciousness to organize them into something that he could understand.
Chifley guided Sammy onto the bed beside Gil, tenderly tucking the blankets around them both. I'm just going to change, okay? I won't be long.
Sammy hummed quietly, melting into the bed as the covers were tucked in around them. His shading is a warm cream, his gold eyes already starting to drift shut. Nearly without conscious thought, Sammy reached out to grasp at Gil's hand in his, softly squeezing it once, before loosening enough Gil could slip out of his hold if he wanted.
Gil's eyes opened to let out as his hand was grasped and squeezed gently. He took his hand back, only to inch closer and slip his arm around Sammy. His eyes slid shut as he let out a sigh, falling asleep with his forehead pressed up against his nemesis.
Chifley grabbed his sleep clothes and all but ran to the bathroom to change. He was back a few minutes later, in a plain white tee and blue track pants. Quickly tossing his clothes to the side, he pulled himself up onto the bed. Not beside either of them, but instead at the head of the bed, sitting with his back against the headboard.
Sammy felt the bed dip and blindly reaches out with his other hand to flop it onto Chifley's foot. Content that Sammy could find his other partner, he relaxes with a contented sigh, his shading a rich, rich cream.
He squeaked a little before getting as comfortable as he could with Sammy clinging to his leg. True to his word, he started carding his fingers through Sammy's hair. He did look at Gil and his long, beautiful hair, but he was already asleep. Touching him would wake him up.
Sammy relaxes fully. Chif, he quietly mumbles, his shading cherry pink airbrushed with rose. This is nice.
Chifley leant down to kiss Sammy's forehead. Sleep.
Okay. Snuggle with us? I want you comfy too. Sammy is in fact starting to drift off to sleep, but he's stubbornly clinging to consciousness until he's reassured that Chifley is also comfortable and resting.
Smiled and laid down, still across the headboard above the pillows, belly near Sammy's head and face closer to Gil's. Pass me that blanket.
Sammy lets out a satisfied hum and does as asked. You're good, Chif. Glad I mended your clothes that night.
He tucked the blanket around himself and resumed playing with Sammy's hair. Me too, he whispered. Me too.
Sammy falls asleep with a smile on his face, the pink shifting to a contented cream with airbrushed rose.
The next morning, Gil woke up first, his eyes sliding slowly open. His eyelashes fluttered as he realized the position he was in, all snuggled up against Sammy with one arm over him. He looked up along Sammy's long rainbow hair towards the head of the bed. The cymbal clattered against his horn and he froze. eyes flickering to Sammy's face. When he was certain the taller Toon hadn't woken up, he slowly started to extract his arm.
As Gil moved, he discovered a weight on his hair. Chifley was snuggled in close, head on top of his long red-orange locks. He mumbled a little, grimacing slightly.
Gil blinked, looking up at Chifley up there. He wrinkled his eyebrows, slowly drawing his arm away from Sammy. He reached up and gathered most of his hair, slowly trying to pull it out from underneath the blue-haired Toon without waking him up.
He twitched, and his eyes cracked open, blinking blankly.
The purple devil stopped, looking up at Chifley. He let his shoulders dip downwards before slowly sitting up and to the side. He turned to look down towards him, a sheepish smile on his face. "Hey, Chifley, I was just going to the bathroom."
Chifley blinked at him and then frowned. "No, you weren't."
Gil's ears tilted downwards at Chifley's words, looking away from him. He reached up and tucked the edge of his bathrobe over his scar, hiding it more completely. "No, I wasn't."
Chifley sat up. "What's wrong?" he asked gently.
The purple devil looked down at his hands, frown on his face. He curled his pointed fingers inwards before relaxing them. He turned to look up at Chifley, lifting one of his hands to press against his cheek again. "I don't know what I'm doing. Shouldn't this be a lot harder? He just forgave me."
Chifley reached a hand out and put it on Gil's shoulder. "Sammy's heart doesn't have a lot of room for grief and anger," he said. "You did want him to forgive you, didn't you?"
As Chifley placed his hand on the devil's shoulder, he tensed for a moment, but didn't pull away. Gil wrinkled his eyebrows together, blinking. I did want him to forgive me, but I thought it would take more than just an apology. And why are you just not mad at me?"
"Do you want me to be?" he asked. "My anger is spent. Sammy is resting easy. I don't want to be angry anymore."
Gil wrinkled his eyebrows, pressing his lips together. "Sort of." His long tail twitched up and down beside him as he looked slowly up towards Chifley. "I suppose I don't understand why you aren't anymore."
Chifley's shoulders slumped a little. "It was heartbreaking, Gil, watching him suffer like he did. I think I gave him some comfort, but it is literally my job to heal, and I could do nothing." He said it felt like broken glass in his chest. He ran a hand through his ash-blue hair. "I have never been that angry before. Caught me off guard." He lifted his eyes to go, which is arguably worse than catching on fire.
Gil's ears twitched up and down, pulling his hand from his chest to rub against the dark circles under his eyes. He gave a sigh, glancing back over his shoulder at the sleeping form of Sammy. "I don't know if I could say that I know what that feels like. To feel like there was broken glass in my chest." He looked back at Chifley, meeting the blue-haired Toon's gaze. "You were right to be angry at me. I deserve your anger. It doesn't really explain why you aren't anymore." He paused a moment, the catching on fire comment, twirling a finger through one lock of his hair. "I've never been that angry before. Never cared enough to be that angry before. I didn't know that I could even do that."
"Anger is hard to maintain," If the source is no longer there, Chifley offered. Yes, I was angry at you, at the hurt you caused, but he looked pointedly down at Sammy. Do you know what his colors mean?
Gille shifted around on the bed so that he was facing Chifley, looking over towards Sammy. He couldn't relate to anger just going out like a puff of smoke. The only reason why he exploded right then, because his had all built up over time. He folded his hands in his lap in front of him. I don't know most of them. I know that pink means that he thinks whoever he's with is pretty. I think black means he's really angry, but I only saw that one once. I didn't really know what the bluish purple one meant until I talked with Psychopomp, and he said Sammy looked like he couldn't breathe.
How astute of him, Chifley said with a sigh. Blue and purple are not good colors. Before yesterday, he didn't change. But now, he motioned to Sammy with a hand.
Sammy's shading is warm cream, with gold and pink fading at the edges and a warm gradient as he sleeps, a soft smile on his face.
Gille gives a little shrug. Psychopomp's always been the one to see through any sort of deception I've ever tried. He's always watching, so I always figured he was just a whole lot better at reading people than I am. He looked at Chifley for a moment before looking back at Sammy. He reached up to twirl his mustache between two fingers before looking back at the blue-haired Toon. The pink means that's good, right? What does the cream mean? Or the gold? Or the fact that they're all there together?
You feel more than one emotion at a time, generally, don't you? The yellows and golds are happy, joy. Cream is content. Pink is love. Chifley's voice was very fond, and he was blushing a little.
Gille wrinkled his eyebrows together, stroking his chin. Oh, yeah, sometimes. He pauses and stares blankly at Chifley as he fully explains what pink means. He looked at Sammy and then back at the blue-haired Toon, his expression only growing more confused. Why would Sammy feel love around me? He thought. Love? Why would that one mean such an intense emotion? Are you feeling alright, Chifley? You look a little flushed.
Chifley blinks, then gives Gille a bewildered look. What?
Gille tilts his head to the side, looking even more confused. What do you mean, what? When Toons feel sick, their cheeks turn a little red, right? Well, when certain Toons feel sick. Your cheeks are a little red, so I was asking if you were feeling alright.
I'm fine. He gave a small smile. I tend to go pale when I'm sick. Well, paler.
Gille's eyelashes fluttered before he nodded. Oh, okay. I do that too. Or I used to. Before Psychopomp and I became best friends. He pauses for a moment, his eyebrows furrowing as a thinking expression came onto his face. Wait. Don't tell me. I can figure it out myself.
Okay. Chifley blinked at him, but then giggled. Take your time. I'll wait. He put a hand to his face in disbelief.
He snaps his fingers in the air, looking like he figured it out. It's too... I'm sorry, I can't. I have to... Okay. I'm just laughing over this idiot. He snaps his fingers in the air, looking like he figured it out. It's too warm in here. You're overheating. It's probably because you're still wearing that blanket. Gille grinned widely, reaching up to tug the dark orange bathrobe over his scar again.
Chifley's other hand came up to his face and he just sighed into his palms. You really are the biggest idiot I know.
Oh! Gil scoffed, placing his hand on his chest, splaying out his fingers across the fuzzy orange bathrobe. I really am offended now, I'll have you know. I am not an idiot. So if I'm the biggest idiot you know, then I guess you really don't know any idiots at all. He started to wiggle out from underneath the blankets, sliding off the bed and onto the floor. His tail behind him made loops as he turned around to look back at the two tunes remaining on the bed. It's about time that we ate breakfast, right? I'm starving.
Chifley looked up at him. Yeah. He looked down at Sammy, then leant down to kiss his cheek before squirming out of the bed to follow Gil. Yeah, sure.
Sammy let out a quiet sigh and curls into the empty spaces of the bed, the pink shading on him growing more vibrant.
Out in the main room, the abandoned pizza had been tidied away, and all the lights turned off.
Gil blinks as he watched Chifley lean down and give Sammy a kiss, tilting his head to the side for a moment. He turned and almost ran into the doorframe, stopping just short of it. Right. I should put my glasses on before I run into something. He reaches down into his pocket and pulls out his thick rectangle glasses, placing them on his face as he follows the blue-haired tune into the main room. He does a little skip as he heads to the kitchen, opening up the fridge to see what was inside. What's for breakfast? Marcel usually makes eggs or pancakes.
Chifley thought about it. I could make pancakes. We haven't had those in a while. He rubbed the back of his head. We usually just have toast or cereal. I'm not a very good cook.
Gil looked back at Chifley, his tail looping around behind him and making hearts. He grinned mischievously, his pointed ears tilting upwards. Really? Because he can't be any worse than I am. I once burnt water.
Chifley paused in getting things out of the cupboard. How?
Gil looked at Chifley, pulling out the eggs and milk. He grinned wider, walking over to place the objects on the counter. Well, you see, I put too many logs on the fire, I think. That made this pot I'd stolen too hot. And then there was this absolutely terrible smell.
Chifley snorted and started laughing in that soft laugh of his. You destroyed a cooking pot.
Gil grinned wider, turning back to grab the butter. He spun on his heel, his tail pulling the fridge doors shut. Yeah, Psychopomp won't let me live it down, even though he can't eat. Even though he doesn't eat. I somehow cooked the food for my date with Sammy correctly. Even I was surprised that I could eat it. He let out a loud cackle, placing the butter beside everything else. The next thing we need is flour. Flour?
Chifley's laugh drifted into a giggle, then a smile. He pet a large paper bag he had already fetched from the cupboard. Right here. Gil had seen Marcel cook, measuring flawless technique, every bit a professional chef. Chifley, though, measured nothing. He poured flour into the bowl until he thought it was enough, added sugar by the dessert spoon. How sweet do you like them? He asked.
Gil tilted his head to the side, his tail twirling and twirling around behind him. His grin widened, his orange eyes almost sparkling. Very sweet. For a while, I subsisted completely off of candy.
Chifley nodded and added 4 spoons to the flour, giving them a quick mix with the spoon before making a well in the middle and putting in 3 eggs and some milk, again without measuring. Can you grab the pan? It's in that cupboard there. He nodded at one of the underbench cupboards.
He easily opened the bench cupboard that was pointed at with his tail, reaching in and pulling out one of the pans. He swung his tail around with some difficulty, placing it on the stove as he twirled around. He turned back to Chifley, grinning with pride as he sweat from the effort, and he Anything else?
A spatula and a ladle. Second drawer.
Gil decides to get those with his hands this time, pulling them out and setting them down on the counter beside Chifley. He stepped up beside the smaller Toon, his tail swinging around and smacking Chifley's butt. So, what do you do next?
Chifley jumped, blush coming back with a vengeance. Cook them, he squeaked. He's shaking his head a bit before turning the stove on.
He raised his eyebrows, a smile on his face that said he knew exactly what he'd been doing just then. His eyes widened almost like he was surprised at Chifley's reaction. It was pretty clear that Gil was trying to act innocent and quite failing to do so. We don't stir the batch first?
Chifley looked down at the bowl. Yep, he had completely neglected to do that. He sighed. The pan has to heat up anyway, he responded, cheeks burning with embarrassment as well, as he started to stir the batter. If you want to be helpful, put a little bit of butter in the pan for me.
Gil considered that for a moment, his tail twitching up and down behind him. Does he want to be helpful? He chuckled lowly at the clear embarrassment on Chifley's face. Turning on his heel towards the fridge again, his tail slid up the blue-haired Toon's leg before he stepped away, grabbing the butter. He turned back around, unwrapping enough proportion of the stick. He starts to raise it towards his mouth.
Chifley forced himself to ignore that feeling of Gil's tail on his leg, watching him out of the corner of his eye as he moved to the fridge. He started when Gil's waltz took on a distinct, familiar, mischievous tone, his head snapping up. Gil, don't you dare!
Gil's mouth was halfway open, his sharp teeth inches away from the stick of butter. He looked at Chifley, his tail flicking back and forth playfully behind him. He smiled, his orange eyes glowing. Don't I dare what?
Chifley gave him a look. Don't bite the butter, he sighed. There are chopping boards in the cupboard and knives in the drawer. He waggled a batter-covered spoon at him. You're not the only one eating these, you know.
Gil pulled the butter away from his mouth, his tail twirling around behind him as his eyes narrowed. What? Are you afraid of a little saliva? He moved over to retrieve the chopping board and the knives, placing them on the counter. He sliced a pat of butter off the stick, sliding it into the pan. There.
Chifley rolled his eyes and grabbed the ladle, coming over to the stove with the boil. Gil, I used to eat dirt as a child. I'm not worried about germs. He huffed, swirling the butter around the pan before spooning in some batter. It's just inconsiderate.
Gil wrinkled his nose at those words, turning his face upwards. He put his hand to his forehead, pretending to feel faint. It was a little too over-exaggerated to be anywhere near convincing. Ew, you ate dirt? People walk on that. He took his hand away from his forehead, swaying his hips back and forth. He places his hands on his hips, sticking his forked tongue out at Chifley. Yeah? I'm inconsiderate. I'm the villain.
I'm sorry we're not all nobles from a big city, Chifley responded, flipping the pancake over. We played in the dirt. At Gil's declaration, he sighed a bit. There you go again with that villain nonsense.
Gil made a slight snorting noise, moving to lean against the counter. His tail smacked flatly against the cabinet door beside him, his pointed ears twitching up and down. He reached up, pressing his hard hand over the partially exposed scar again. He tilted his head away from the stove, his hair shifting to the side. He stared at Chifley for a couple of moments, fluttering his eyelashes. I've been the villain for as long as I can remember. I did say I should stop earlier, but Honestly, what else should I say? He reached into one of his pockets, pulling out his brush. He started to run it through the bottom of his hair, starting the long process of brushing it.
Chifley slammed the spatula down on the bench top with a loud clatter. Villains do not untie their prey just because they ask. Villains do not apologize for their slights against those they have hurt. That low violin that Gil had heard the previous day touched the air again, but it was wobbly, as if the hand holding the bow was shaking. Chifley didn't take notice of it, and he took a step towards Gil, facing him fully. Villains care nothing except for their own greed and ambitions. Villains lie and cheat and steal from those lower than them. Villains bring unfathomable torture to anyone who stands in their way, man, woman, or child. His hands were balled into fists. Villains show no mercy no matter how much you beg or cry or plead. Villains destroy people, much so that they'd rather be dead.
Gil paused mid-stroke of his brush at the loud sound, looking up from what he was doing at Chifley. He blinked rapidly, not moving or retreating. He simply stood there, his eyebrows furrowing at the sound of the low violin. As the sound of the low violin hit his ears, he raised his eyebrows upwards as the blue-haired tune continued, his pointed ears twitching downwards. He worked his jaw back and forth, pressing his lips together. I know you're upset. Yesterday I need water. Yesterday, you had that same low violin playing out loud. But I need you to understand. I used to lie, cheat, and steal from anyone who I bumped into on the street, because I could. Yeah, I have standards, but the best villains do. It really seems like you were talking about monsters, rather than villains to me. He said his words calmly, but there was the barest tremble of anger as he said monsters, his eyes narrowing. For a moment his bathrobe turned red, before it turned back to dark orange again. It's hard to think about what exactly changed, when exactly I grew to care more than I used to. Why I would willingly put myself in harm's way to protect another person. But that is exactly how I'm feeling now. It conflicts with everything I knew. Old habits die hard.
Chifley was shaking. You can learn and grow and change, he breathed. Some people can't or won't and go to their graves proud of the things they've done. That's not you. That's not you. Chifley's voice often had a bit of a grumble or growl in it, but it was particularly noticeable now. And he was holding his breath. But it wasn't enough to stop thin rivers from trailing down his cheeks.
Gil swallowed as he watched Chifley shake and tremble, shoving the top of his brush into his pocket, not properly putting it back into his hammer space. He looked up at the taller tune's face, his eyebrows wrinkling together. Then he noticed the tears, and it suddenly felt like he'd been stabbed through the chest again. He placed a hand over his scar for a moment, the white turning blue where his fingertips touched. He pulled his hand away, hesitantly reaching for Chifley. Chifley, would you like a hug? You're crying.
Chifley blinked, and a hand came up to wipe away some of the tears, as if he hadn't realized they were there. Oh.
He slowly, carefully placed one of his hands on Chifley's shoulder, a slight wetness coming to his eyes, where it had been completely dry before. He slowly, hesitantly wrapped his other arm around the blue-haired Toon, gently pulling him into a hug. I promise I've gotten better at this than I used to be.
Chifley leant into Gil a little without a thought. You're not like he was, he whispered, his hands clinging to the soft fabric of Gil's robe.
Gil encircled Chifley with his arms as if he could protect the blue-haired Toon from whatever he had been remembering. He gently placed his hands on the taller Toon's back, his arms less stiff than the first time he'd offered Sandy a hug. Who was he?
As Gil put his hands on Chifley's back, several things seemed to happen at once. Chifley went stiff, and the shaking violin screeched harshly. His arms suddenly snapped out, and in the same movement he pulled his spear from his hammer space and struck Gil with it in the chest. The blade, however, had not extended, so while he was not back, he wasn't hurt. Chifley's eyes were wide, the black pupils in them shrunk down to wild pinpricks. His eyes were locked on Gil, but somehow he couldn't see him.
It happened so fast that Gil's head nearly spun. He stumbled back a few feet. A surprised cough coming from him. He smoothed his hands over where Chifley had struck him, his eyes wide. His cymbal swung back and forth, clattering noisily against his horn. He took a breath. His gently glowing orange eyes gliding over the taller Toon's stance. The purple devil's gaze was drawn to the wild pinpricks that were his eyes, remembering how Sandy had almost struck him with her lollipop on that cold night. He lifted his hands, palms towards the blue-haired Toon. He didn't approach or step away, staying exactly where he was. Gil cleared his throat, his tail making knots behind him. Chifley, it's okay. It's just me, Gil. You're in your apartment, in your kitchen. You are safe, Chifley.
There was a long moment as Gil's words slowly penetrated the fog in Chifley's mind. He blinked once, then twice, and then his pupils slowly got bigger, recognition building in them. From recognition came realization. Chifley started trembling, and his weapon fell to the tiles with a loud clatter.
He watched as Chifley came back to himself, staying exactly as he was until the moment the weapon fell from his hands. Gil only then stepped closer, offering his hands towards the taller Toon. He came within reaching distance, not coming any closer. Chifley, you are all right. You are safe. It's just me.
His knees gave way as Gil stepped close, falling first to his knees, then coiling into a ball on the floor, sobbing.
Gil blinks before very slowly getting down on the floor beside him, folding his legs over each other. Gently reached and placed his hand on Chifley's head, stroking the taller Toon's blue hair hesitantly. Hey now, it's okay. You're okay. You're alright. I'm right here.
Chifley just continued to sob into the floor. In the bedroom, the mattress dipped as someone climbed up onto it, and a pair of small hands grasped Sammy's shoulder and shook him. Sammy, wake up!
Sammy starts awake, his golden eyes shooting open, his shading going sky blue with an airbrushing of lavender. Missy? What's wrong?
Looked worried.
Chifley, his music is all scratched and broken. You gotta help!
Sammy is immediately out of the bed, only pausing to briefly hold out his hand for Missy to take before he's heading out of the bedroom and into the apartment proper.
There's the distinct smell of pancake burning, wafting out of the kitchen.
Sammy skids around the corner, his shading lilac. Gil! Chifley! What's wrong?
Gil looks up from the floor, his orange eyes a little glassy, even behind his glasses. He paused in his stroking of Chifley's hair, his eyelashes fluttering. I touched his back. I was just giving him a hug. I didn't mean for him to fall apart on me like this.
Missy winced and walked over.
You can't touch Chifley's back,
She said to Gil, firmly but softly.
He's hurt there, Sammy says softly, walking to the kitchen and taking the burnt pancake off the pan and turning off the stove. I tried healing it the first night Chifley and I met, and it didn't take. He gets down onto the ground in the middle point of both Gil and Chifley, folding his legs underneath him with the grace of someone who's done this motion all their life, as if the nightgown were something far more fancy than just a simple dress. Hey, Chif, he softly says. Is it okay if I touch your shoulder? It's just me. Just your Sammy.
Gil blinked owlishly at Missy, his eyebrows furrowing with mild confusion. And then Sammy explains, Gil's expression dropping into abject horror as his gaze returns to Chifley. His tail twitches behind him, his hair starting to float upwards as he thought about what the blue-haired Toon had said just before he tried to hug him. His bathrobe switched from the dark orange to red, his sharp teeth grinding together. He pulled his hand back, away from Chifley for a moment, his sharp fingers curling into the palm of his hand. He placed the fist over his scar, pressing against it as he looked to the side and into the middle distance.
Chifley was unresponsive, just weakly crying into the floor. Missy looked like she could cry too.
When I did it, he couldn't talk for a while after,
she told them.
So you have to not touch it. Not ever, okay?
She grabbed at Gil's robe.
Sammy softly sighs, a quiet hum under his breath as he gently leans closer to Chifley and simply tucks him to his side, running his hand through Chifley's hair. It's going to be okay, Chif, he quietly whispered, his shading airbrushed deep blue. He looks up at Gil. It's not your fault. You didn't know. We just need to be careful with him. Not like us. Unsaid is the words he can't take a hit. We'll take care of him, Missy. Thank you for waking me up, okay? It's going to be okay. Sammy's voice is soft and reassuring, and his expression extremely soft as he looks at his partner's younger sister. Do you want a hug?
Gil snapped his gaze to Missy as she grabbed at his bathrobe, his narrow orange eyes glowing so bright. Sparks and embers started to come off of his hair, floating up into the air. He growled under his breath, digging his nails into his palm. His tail lashed back and forth, thumping against the counter. Missy, let go. His voice was just barely held under control, his shoulders tense as he intentionally locked his muscles. He wasn't going to lash out. He wasn't going to do it. He gnashed his teeth, glancing over towards Sammy. Blue liquid started to drip from his fist. I'm going to find that. I'm going to find him.
Missy immediately let go of Gil and rapidly backed up from him, crossing the room to Sammy. She could hear Gil's theme just as Chifley could, and she was frightened by it. Chifley hadn't noticed, but his crying had started to slow, reduced to whimpers, punctuated by the occasional sob.
Sammy's arms wrapped around Missy and pulled her into his lap, enveloping her entirely, tucking her close. It's okay, he quietly says, smoothing out her hair and dropping a kiss to the crown of her head. He looks up. Gil, you might want to take it outside and let it out entirely there, he softly said. He looks down at Chifley, at his back, and his face tightens into a grimace as the shading turns red briefly, before turning back to that muted, deep airbrushed blue. I'd be right behind you, Gil, but you can't find the dead.
Gil turned away from Missy, Chifley, and Sammy as she let go and rapidly backed away, curling his shoulders forward. He continued to spit Grolix under his breath, his hair hissing as it danced around him. His pointed ears were tilted downwards as he leaned forward onto his crossed leg. He took a deep breath, letting it out slowly, and then another, closing his eyes. He shook his head as Sammy spoke, relaxing his fist as he sat there. He took another breath in, let it out slowly, his hair ceasing to spark. I'm calm now. I can be calm. His hair drifted down around him, laying as it normally did. His bathrobe retained its red color, but the purple devil's tail had stilled to a slight twitch. He gently ran his thumb over his blue palm, a slight, almost sourceless, spooky giggle coming from the new thin scar. He blinked, turning slightly to more properly look at Sammy. He screwed his eyebrows together, pressing his lips together as he thought for a moment. I feel like you're wrong, but I'm really starting to get a headache. He lifts up his blue hand, pushing his glasses up and pinching the bridge of his nose.
Missy whimpered and clung to Sammy.
Please don't be mad at Chifley. He doesn't mean it.
Chifley had fallen silent now, laying limply on his side on the tiles.
Sammy gently strokes Missy's hair. He's not mad at Chifley, Missy. He's mad that someone hurt Chif in the first place. He looks at Chifley and runs his hand through Chifley's hair, tracing soothing circles against the blue-haired Toon's scalp. You're okay, Chif. You're okay. We're all here with you, and you're safe now. His voice is soft and reassuring.
Gil breathed more easily, leaving dabs of blue on the bridge of his nose as he pulled his fingers away. His pointed ears stayed tilted downwards as he looked up to Missy, folding his hands in front of him. He looked down to Chifley, his orange eyes still glowing with the anger he had managed to get under control. He took a deep breath, let it out slowly again, reaching for his pocket. He pulled an orange handkerchief from his hammer space, wiping his hands free of the blue ink. He used 2 fingers to put the dirty cloth back into his pocket, before fully turning in place. He clasped his hands together in front of him, his shoulders tipping downwards. Sammy is right, Missy. I'm not angry at Chifley. I'm angry at the ugly fuck who put a wound on his back that can't be healed with the power granted to us. Did I scare you? It's alright now. I'm not angry anymore. He forced his tone to be smooth, to be calm, and his expression approachable. He relaxed his muscles, his bathrobe slowly turning from red back to dark orange.
Missy sniffled a little, but nodded.
Okay.
And she believed him. She looked down at her brother, who was still and quiet on the floor between them, eyes half open, staring blankly at the floor. She whimpered.
Missy, is it okay if I put you down for now and hold Chifley for a bit? Sammy quietly asks.
She nods.
Yeah.
Sammy dropped a kiss on her forehead, smoothing back her hair from her face. He's going to be okay, all right? We're going to take care of him. He gives her another hug before letting her go. When his lap is freed, he gently, ever so gently, scoops Chifley up into his arms, drawing him into his lap, nestling him into the crook of Sammy's neck, tenderly rocking the smaller Toon slightly. You're gonna be okay, Chifley, Sammy prossed him. Dropping a kiss to his forehead, he gently wiped away the tears still drying on Chifley's cheek with his thumb. Sammy looks up and his expression softens even more. Oh, come here. He digs out a small handkerchief from his sleeve, rainbow-edged and sparkling white.
Gil smiled at Missy, kindness touching his eyes for a few moments as she sniffled and believed him. Dark orange spread completely over his bathrobe, no red left to be shown. He put the anger aside, pushing it deep within himself. He sat there watching, with his hands clasped together in front of him. He blinked rapidly at Sammy's expression, wrinkling his eyebrows together. His tail twitched back and forth behind him, his eyes narrowing. Why? He glanced towards Chifley and back up to the Toon's face.
Sammy rolls his golden eyes. Because you have something on your face, dumbass. Despite the droll tone, it is still incredibly fond. And then he reaches over to tug Gille closer, flashing his handkerchief in demonstration. Let me get it for you.
Gille slowly and tiredly blinked, letting Sammy tug him closer. He easily slipped across the floor, his fuzzy dark orange bathrobe only assisting in the easy movement. He glanced down towards Chifley for a moment, before looking back up at the Toon. The sky blue spots were underneath his glasses and had dripped a little down his nose. His pointed ears flicked up and down, his tail twitching back and forth. He settled, just placing his hands on his legs. Okay.
Sammy gently wiped the sky blue ink off of Gille's nose, folding the fabric up to a clean side and taking Gille's glasses off, wiping down the frames for any ink on them before taking the tip of the handkerchief and tenderly wiping the spots underneath where the frames had rested. He hands Gille back his glasses and gently tugs the purple imp to let him rest against his shoulder as he slips the stained fabric away into its hammer space. There we go. All clean. How is your hand? Do you need me to cast anything?
Throughout the whole thing, Gille blinked and only mildly moved away from Sammy, wiping at his face. He reached up and rubbed at his eye while the Toon worked on his glasses, the light blue ink easily being removed. When his glasses were handed back, he carefully put them back onto his face, blinking the blurriness out of his eyes. His eyelashes fluttered as he was tugged closer, his tail curling around Sammy's hips. He lifts up his hand, showing the Toon the small hairline blue scar. I'm fine. Psychopomp showed me how to heal with just a touch of my fingers. I had to use it a lot when I was younger. I'd constantly trip in the attic and scrape up my hands and knees. He wiggled his fingers at Sammy, before looking down to Chifley in his lap. He hesitantly reached his hand, placing it on top of his blue hair. Is he going to be alright? Gille whispered.
Chifley's eyes had fallen closed, and he didn't twitch at Gille's touch. Missy scooched closer, looking like she wanted to be held too, but was wary of getting into Gille's lap without permission.
His music is quiet, but back to normal, she said softly. He's asleep.
Sammy smoothed his fingers over Chifley's forehead, brushing his blue bangs away and to the side. And if he wakes up, we'll be there to make sure he stays okay, he says softly. He reaches out and scoops up the hand Gille had shown him and squeezing. Are you okay, Gille? We've already covered how Chifley's doing for now, but I'm sure this isn't exactly what you expected when you woke up this morning.
Gille's orange eyes dimmed in light slightly, flicking over to Missy as she moved closer, quietly looking up at her face. He hadn't the slightest idea why she had moved closer, and it was written all over his face. He looked back to Chifley as she talked about him, his pointed ears twitching up and down. His tail twitched up and down against Sammy's side. He gently moved his hand away from the blue-haired Toon. He reached up to where he'd been hit, rubbing his hand over it back and forth. He blinked at Sammy's words, his gaze drawn back to the Toon as his hand was grasped and squeezed. I'm real. The purple devil Toon's voice was quiet as he turned his head away from the little girl, trying to make it so that she couldn't hear those words coming from him. He swallowed dryly, his pointed ears tilting downwards. I'm fine. I seem to cause these sorts of situations everywhere I go.
Missy scooted a tiny bit closer to Gille.
It's okay. Chifley doesn't tell people about it. I touched it once. He hadn't told me either.
She reached a hand out, but stopped short of touching Gil.
You won't be mad. He likes you.
Hey, Sammy says softly, bringing Gil's hand up and gently pressing a kiss to Gil's knuckles. It's going to be okay. We're all really new to this. We're all going to mess up during this. We don't really know all of everyone's hurts and triggers? Yeah, triggers yet. We'll need to actually talk about it together so we can stop this and other things like it from repeating again. Right now, the best thing to do is say you're sorry to Chifley when he wakes up, and then we can talk after breakfast. His eyes catch Missy moving closer to Gil and gently nudges Gil in the knee with their intertwined hands. I think someone wants to be held, he says in undertone, gesturing to Missy with his head.
The purple devil toon looked at Missy as she got even closer, his eyebrows wrinkling together in a clear look of confusion. His tail twitched up and down beside Sammy, smacking against the floor for a moment. He tilted his head to the side, his gaze going to stare at Missy's extended hand. I don't know how true that is. He paused as Sammy kissed the back of his knuckles, his long eyelashes fluttering against his glasses. His pointed ears twitched upwards, relaxing a little bit. Triggers? Like the ones on a gun. Alright, I can do that. It was painless the first time I apologized. It should not be hurtful this time either. He looked over towards Missy as the taller toon nudged him, blinking owlishly again. His eyebrows raised, and he gently lifted his arm towards her. Hey there, you can sit in my lap if that's what you want. Sandy never asks to hug me. She normally just bowls me over.
Missy snuggled into his lap immediately and looked up at him.
It is true. I know. I can hear it. His music changes when he's talking about you.
Same as for Sammy, she told Gil, flabbergasted that he wouldn't believe her. She wasn't a liar.
Even when he's mad. He was mad at me and Sandy yesterday, but he couldn't stop his music from shuffling a little when he said your name. I heard it. I did.
Triggers can also be things that upset you because of trauma you've gone through, like how Charm Person and other similar enchantment magic is a trigger for me. Sammy softly explains. He squeezes Gil's hand one more time before releasing it, standing up with Chifley securely in his arms. I'm going to set him down on the couch to rest, okay? Pretty sure both of you are pretty hungry by now.
Gil blinked as Missy immediately crawled into his lap and started to snuggle up against him. He raised his eyebrows up. They kept going, jumping off of his skin and hovering above his head as she continued to talk. He looked over to Sammy as he explained, nodding briefly. He looked up at the taller toon as he caught up, his expression helpless. He didn't want Sammy to leave him alone with Missy, his pointed ears tilting downwards. He slowly and mutely nodded to the question, his mouth opening for a minute before a very loud growling noise comes from his stomach. I am a little famished, he said, following it, looking mildly embarrassed. The purple devil toon looked back to Missy, wrinkling his eyebrows together as he looked back at her. It does? And he was mad at you and Sandy for what?
Missy nodded, leaning against him and holding onto his robe for balance.
It gets this little bounce in it. It's a good bounce. It's quick and it's lively. His music never sounds like that, except with you two.
His second question made her pout.
Sandy came to the playground at school, and when we went shopping, it was really fun. When Chifley was cranky, said Sandy shouldn't kidnap people, even if you do it.
Sammy sets Chifley down gently, setting him on his side and preventing his back from connecting with the back of the couch with the cushions. He bends down and drops a kiss on Chifley's sleeping brow, smoothing away blue bangs. He draws back, only to pull out a large blue blanket from his sleeve, the edges lined with dark blue satin. It looks patched and worn, but is freshly laundered and brings with it the scent of petrichor. He settles it over Chifley and tucks him in. Rest well, Chif, he says emotions welling up inside him and wanting to spill out into words he doesn't know how to yet to say, little confessions he doesn't know how to phrase yet. He settles for simply kissing his partner on the cheek with one final smoothing of Chifley's hair. He walks back into the kitchen, a shading of rich, vibrant gold and airbrushed rose, and scrubbing at his cheeks.
Gil let his hands fall beside him as he marveled at Missy's explanation, his sharp teeth parting as he let out a near silent "oh." His eyes blinked rapidly, reaching up to scratch at the side of his face. He started to smile, his orange eyes glowing softly. Behind him, his tail started to lip around itself, forming hearts along its length. As Missy started to explain that Chifley was cranky, he started to laugh. I'll have to ask why he scolded my little sister for that. I'm pretty much teaching her all of the tricks of my trade. Besides, Sammy's the one who kidnapped me when we met. The purple devil Toon chuckled in a sinister manner, a mischievous look on his face. Missy, sometime do you want to go fuck with some rich asshole's mansion with me? We could go see how many things we can misplace before he starts thinking someone's been stealing from him.
She looked up at him.
What's fuck mean? Is that another word for prank? I like pranks.
She asked him, honestly.
And thus Gil continues to teach little children curse words. Gil grinned widely, his orange eyes glowing. He nodded emphatically at her questions, reaching up to pat her on the head. To fuck with is a phrase for prank.
She squinted at him, not believing that somehow. But she grinned at him anyway.
I want to do pranks. Yeah,
She told him.
I'm not very strong yet, but I can try.
It is right around this time that Sammy comes back into the kitchen. He pauses, staring suspiciously at Gil. Gil, what did you just rope Missy into?
Gil narrowed his eyes slyly as Missy squinted at him, but grinned widely as she grinned anyways. He rustled her hair before looking up as Sammy came in. He waved back and forth in front of his face, an angelic-looking halo appearing over his head as he gave the most innocent look to the taller Toon. Oh, just some good, clean fun. Nothing to worry your pretty head over, Sammy.
Sammy squints at Gil, but his face turns bright pink at the compliment and he starts spluttering. He walks past Gil and Missy and starts working on making pancakes. They come out a bit more overly golden than Sammy would have liked, but none of them burnt. The stack grows high as Sammy works through the batter, and then he turns to Missy. Hey, Missy, do you know where Chif keeps the syrup?
Huh? Oh, in that cupboard there, with the honey and peanut butter and stuff.
She said, pointing.
Gil stayed where he was, sitting comfortably on the floor, his arms more around Missy than actually touching her. He grinned up at Sammy as the taller Toon moved over to make pancakes, his stomach growling again at the wonderful smell. He gently pats at Missy, smiling at her. We should probably get off the floor to eat.
She nodded keenly.
Yeah, okay.
And she pulled herself out of Gil's lap, offering him a hand as if she were going to help him up.
Sammy gets the syrup out of the cupboard Missy had shown him and then goes to flip the final pancake out of the pan into the tall stack of pancakes. He blinks. The pancake from on his spatula is gone. Where? He looks up, shading gray. The pancake was slowly unsticking itself from the ceiling and fell with a plop back onto his face.
Gil reached up and curled Missy's fingers inwards and away from him, getting up himself. He wobbled as he reached his full height, straightening his bathrobe so that his scar would be less visible. He reached over and ruffled her hair before looking over towards Sammy just as the pancake plopped onto his face. He threw back his head and laughed loudly, holding his sides. He pointed up at the taller Toon, continuing to laugh.
Missy pouted as her help was refused, but let it go. She looked over at Sammy just in time to see the pancake meet Sammy's face, and she squealed with laughter, grasping at her sides.
Sammy splutters, the pancake slowly sliding off onto his face, to plop into his hands. He sticks his tongue out at both of them before starting to giggle himself. He shakes his head, rainbow curls shifting in a riot of colors before he tears off a bite of the pancake in his hand and samples it. Oh, not as bad as I was worried it'd be, he quietly murmured, chewing. The edges of this pancake are slightly darker than the rest, having stuck to the pan.
Hey, can we take a break?
Yee.
Yeah.
Pause. There we go. Gil reached up and wiped his eyes free of tears, sighing as he calmed down. He walked over to Sammy and grinned up at him, picking up the stack of pancakes. He twirled on his heel, his tail smacking against the taller Toon's butt. He walked away, going over towards the table. I am absolutely starved. How about we get started on eating right away? What do you think, Missy?
Missy grinned. Yeah, I'm hungry. She ran over to the drawer and fished out some cutlery, but then she stopped and looked at the door towards the lounge room. She listened intently for a second.
Sammy squeaks as Gil's tail smacks him, and he pokes Gil in the shoulder as his longer legs catch up, and then moves past his nemesis, going in the opposite direction towards the couch.
He laughs at Sammy's squeak, his grin wide and obvious on his face. He managed to get halfway to the table before he was poked in the shoulder, his eyebrows wrinkling as he watched the taller Toon walk in the opposite direction. He takes a few swift steps to the table, putting down the plate. He quickly grabbed one of the pancakes, shoving it into his mouth as he followed behind his nemesis to the couch.
Missy followed behind after them. As they stepped into the lounge room, they lay eyes on their partner sitting up on the couch, Sammy's blanket over his lap, staring dully at his hands where they sat on his legs.
Sammy quickly walks over and slides down onto his knees in a smooth, practiced motion in front of where Chifley is sitting up. Hey, Chif, are you feeling okay?
Gil slurped the pancake into his mouth, practically swallowing it whole. His pointed ears tilted downwards as he paused just in Chifley's peripherals. He looked back and forth between the two of them, holding where he was. He licked his lips, his tail swishing back and forth behind him. He watched where he was, tapping his fingers together.
Chifley looked down at Sammy, then glanced up at Missy and Gil. He opened his mouth to speak, but he sighed very softly, shoulders drooping. He gave a nod and reached under the blanket, into the pocket of his track pants, pulling a notebook and pencil out of his hammer space. Flipping to a blank page, he wrote on it quickly before turning it around for Sammy to see. I'm okay.
It's okay not to be okay, Chifley. You don't have to hide it, Sammy softly says. He reaches out his hands, palm out upwards, but he doesn't take Chifley's hands, letting Chifley decide if he wishes to have the contact.
Gil glanced over at Missy for a moment before looking back towards Chifley. He slowly made his way around the couch, standing within arm's reach of Sammy. He stood there, his lips pressed into a line. He hadn't the slightest idea how the blue-haired Toon was feeling, or what he should really do at the moment. His tail twitched up and down, his orange eyes flicking back and forth between Chifley and Sammy.
Chifley looked at Sammy's hand and looked as though he did want to take it. But then Gil came closer. He watched the Warn until he came to a stop near them, before putting pencil to paper, writing a message before holding it up, more pointedly for Gil to read. Did I hurt you? His handwriting was a little shaky, but still legible.
Sammy blinks as he glances at the words not meant for him, then turns to look at Gil, shading gray. Gil, what does he mean? What happened?
The purple devil Toon tilted his head to the side, his long hair shifting with the movement. He leaned way forward as Chifley held up the writing, practically sticking his nose against the paper. He read over the sentence a couple of times before withdrawing. He reached up and pressed against his scar, the light fizzing quietly against his hand. He glanced towards Sammy at his questions before looking back to the blue-haired Toon. He shook his head back and forth, his eyebrows wrinkling together. "No, I hurt you, didn't I? You were upset with me, and then I placed my hands on your back. You were right to push me back like that. I should have asked if it was all right."
Chifley winced, but shook his head, pulling his paper back to write. "It wasn't your fault. I wasn't thinking." He almost looked embarrassed as he was holding his book up for them to see.
Sammy takes one of Chifley's hands and squeezes briefly before getting up, sitting down next to him. "I think that when you get your back touched, it triggers you, like how Dr. Page says charm magic can trigger me. She said it can make us lash out because we're remembering what hurt us."
Gille's pointed ears tilted downwards, and he stepped backwards half a step at the wince, pressing his hand against his scar a little harder. He wrinkled his eyebrows further together, eyes flicking towards the words on the page. He shook his head back and forth, his eyes narrowing. "How is it not my fault? I'm the one who touched your back." His tail twitched back and forth behind him, looking over to Sandy. It started to twitch violently behind him. He dropped to his knees, bowing his head so that he was looking at Chifley's feet. "I never intended to make you feel that way."
Chifley gripped at his notebook tighter and took a moment before writing. "I did not tell you not to. I did not think to. You aren't the first to do what you did." The hug was not unwelcome. He held the notebook down, directly into Gille's line of sight.
The purple devil blinked as the notebook was shoved into his face. And then he blinked again at the writing as he read over it. And then he read over it again. He looked up at Chifley, a confused look on his face. "It wasn't? You attacked me like Sandy almost did after she beat you up and we chased those two Toons away. I know you didn't recognize me at the time. I could see it in your eyes." He slowly got up from his knees, pulling his bathrobe over to cover his scar more. Gille's voice was soft and quiet. "So you don't hate me for doing that to you?"
Chifley gave Gille a tired, apologetic smile and shook his head. He made a come here motion and then pet the couch beside him.
Gille very carefully moved over to sit on the other side of Chifley from Sammy, settling down so that he wasn't touching the blue-haired Toon. He kept his hands in his lap, his tail curled against the arm of the couch.
Chifley put his notebook down and scooted close to close the gap between them. Then he reached out and grabbed Gille's arms, moving them over his shoulders.
Sweat beaded up on Gille's brow as Chifley got closer, his eyes flickering to Sammy once before his arms were grabbed. His attention went back to Chifley, the blue-haired Toon, freezing as his arms were placed over his shoulders. His tail twitched up and down as he stared at the slightly taller Toon.
Once Gille's arms were resting on Chifley's shoulders, he wrapped his own arms around the devil's torso, resting his chin on Gille's shoulder and hugging him tightly.
Gille blinked before slowly wrapping his arms around Chifley's head, reaching up to place one hand on top of the blue-haired Toon's hair. He glanced over at Chifley. He glanced over at Sammy, his expression still shocked. It quickly moved into a look of panic as he tried to figure out if what he was doing was the right thing.
Sammy's expression softened as he gives Gille a nod of approval, his shading yellow. He gives Gille a thumbs up, practically beaming at the two of them.
Chifley slowly relaxed into Gil, just happy to hold on to him. Missy crossed the room to hover close to Sammy, grinning her head off.
Gil's eyes grew glassy for a moment at Sammy's expression before the tallest Toon out of the three of them gave him a thumbs up. He relaxed a little bit, looking down at Chifley. He slowly started to move his hand over his blue hair. The purple devil's expression softened. He continued to speak quietly, his voice like honey. "Hello, Chifley. I'm sorry I did that to you earlier."
While Gil softly speaks to their partner, Sammy glances over at Missy with a grin. He surges forward, then goes sprawling as Missy dances away, landing with a very toony oof, an animated puff of dust at Missy's feet. Sammy pouts. Darn. There goes getting both of the Fordes into hugs, he mutters into the floor.
Chifley's hug tightened ever so slightly around Gil. His breath puffed oddly against Gil's neck, but he stayed quiet. Missy had jumped back when Sammy dove at her, and then looked at him owlishly.
Is that what you wanted? You sounded so cheeky.
She paused and then pounced at Sammy while he was prone.
Gil continued to gently stroke Chifley's hair, starting to blink sleepily. He leaned his sharp cheek against the blue-haired Toon's forehead, his cymbal clattering against his horn. He glanced over where Sammy had managed to collapse to the ground, snickering a little as Missy pounced on to him instead. "I don't think you're ever going to be able to sneak up on either of them, Sammy. I think I got lucky when I kidnapped Chifley."
Sammy groans, visibly pouting, his hair a splash of vibrancy against the floor. Yeah, I think I'm starting to realize that. He rolls over and wraps his arms around Missy, giving her a big squeeze as he sat up. There we go. Now both Fordes are nice and comfy in our arms.
Missy giggled and hugged Sammy close.
You give good hugs, Sammy.
Chifley shuddered in a silent chuckle.
Gil let out a couple of sinister-sounding chuckles, running his sharp fingers over Chifley's hair again. He moved his gaze from Sammy down to the blue-haired Toon, who was practically laying against him, his eyelids sinking a little lower. He let out a bit of a yawn. His sharp teeth parting to reveal the purple inside of his mouth for a moment. "Nice and comfy. Are you comfy, Chifley?"
Sammy hugs Missy back, tucking his face into her green hair to give her head a kiss. So do you, Missy, he says softly. He looks back up at his partners just in time to see Gil yawn, his expression turning soft and gooey as his shading shifts to gold, airbrushed with rose.
Chifley nodded, Gil's yawn infecting him, offering one of his own, followed shortly by a distinct complaint by his stomach.
Sammy grinned. There's pancakes still waiting on the table. Let's eat, then we can take a nap if we want.
The purple devil Toon blinked owlishly for a moment before laughing a little. "Is it really okay to just take a nap after only having woken up about an hour or so ago?" He started to wiggle back and forth, lifting his hands from around Chifley as he got ready to push himself up. "I am still hungry."
Chifley sat back from Gil, smiling. He certainly seemed better.
Sammy scoops Missy up into his arms as he stands, and then walks over to his partners, bending down with her on his hip, and dropping a kiss on both Gil and Chifley's cheeks. We're still tired after breakfast, and I think a nap is definitely in order, considering the emotional events of yesterday and this morning. Sammy raises an eyebrow, looking at both of his partners dryly.
As Chifley sat back, Gil looked at him, blinking sleepily. He yawned again, turning to get up when Sammy suddenly planted a kiss on his cheek. He looked up at his tall nemesis, his expression growing briefly confused. He reached up and touched his cheek, smoothing his fingers over the area. He slowly stood up from the couch, his tail looping in harps behind him. I'm going to be tired after breakfast. I'm still tired. I just didn't know napping during the day was really allowed at a sleepover. I've never been to a sleepover before. He scratched at the edge of his scar, picking his way away from the couch.
Chifley scooped up his notebook, writing on it as he followed the others. A nap sounds great. Missy pouted.
Do I have to nap?
Sammy looks over at Chifley a little helplessly. I'm sure we could set something up for you to watch while we sleep if you're not tired after breakfast, Missy. It is definitely a question. Gil, this is our sleepover. We get to make the rules. If we're all tired, we can nap during the day. It'll be fine. I don't have anywhere to be today.
He glanced back at Chifley, catching the words he had written on the notebook. He pulled out one of the chairs at the table and sat down, reaching for the stack of pancakes without having a place to put them. Oh, well, alright, that sounds good to me. I hadn't planned anything dastardly today either.
Chifley put his notebook on the table before going to one of the cupboards to get plates, coming back with a slightly chipped, clearly second-hand set, which he distributed to the 4 places at the table before sitting down. Missy could sit in at my room and draw or do something quiet while we rest. I don't have much else for her to do that she can do on her own. There was a crossed out O in that first sentence. He slid his message across for Sammy and Gil to read.
Sammy read over Chifley's words as a sudden light bulb lit over his head. He reaches into his sleeves and digs out a leather-bound sketchbook with roses painted on the front and a container of charcoal sticks and colored pencils, setting them on the table. Missy, would you like to draw some things in my sketchbook after breakfast? He's put Missy in her chair and sat down at this point.
Gil's tail flicked up and down as he picked up one of the pancakes, pausing as Chifley set a plate in front of him. He put the one he grabbed down onto it before grabbing 2 more and placing them on top. He reached forward and grabbed the syrup that had been put on the table earlier, pouring a healthy amount onto his 3 pancakes. He noticed there weren't any utensils, pushing back from his seat to gather them. He paused to read, narrowing his eyes at the crossed-out letter. He let it slide, going over to the drawers to pull out some utensils. There isn't a TV in here to put on movies, Sammy. There needs to be extra paper. He reaches into his pocket and pulls out his notebook. He placed it down next to where Missy was sitting, handing her a fork. He hands the other 2 the utensils he found. Sliding back into his seat. You could draw on my notebook too. Just flip to one of the empty pages.
Missy's eyes were alight with stars as she looked at the 2 that her brother loved so much.
Really? I could draw in your books?
There was a very soft snort from Chifley. He was hiding his mouth behind his hand, though he was clearly grinning.
Sammy flushes at Gil's comment, but he's too enamored by Missy's excitement to really argue. Of course you can. Just don't draw any of my pages I've drawn on, okay?
Gil immediately started to eat, slurping up the pancakes drenched in syrup. Yeah, just make sure to draw on one of the blank pages. That way I can shape it. He grinned at... He grinned at Sammy, his tail twitching back and forth behind him. He swallowed, his orange eyes glowing as he got more bites of his food.
Chifley giggled quietly, only his breath making any noise. He picked up his own notebook, exaggeratingly holding it possessively. Missy was bouncing in her seat excitedly. I'm going to do so many things for you! Chifley smiled and served Missy 2 pancakes before putting some on his own plate. The small girl squealed and started eating noisily.
Sammy's shading is bright gold and airbrushed rose as he looks at the other 3 other people at the table, a very fond smile on his face. He grabs 4 of the pancakes, everyone's grabbing up the food, having demolished the stack by half at this point, and pours so much syrup it starts to make a moat around the stack on his plate. He cuts a huge swath out of his stack and practically uses his fork as a kebab before stuffing the entire sticky mess in his mouth.
He raised his eyebrows as Chifley held his own notebook in a possessive manner, mischievous smile coming onto his face. He picked up his plate, scarfing down the rest of his pancakes. He flicked his forked tongue over his lips, gathering up the remains of syrup. He laughed, reaching over to grab 2 more pancakes, pouring more syrup onto them. I look forward to seeing what you draw, Missy. Gille's tail swirled back and forth behind him as he started to eat the 2 pancakes on his plate.
Missy giggled, swinging her legs happily. As they ate the stack down to the last pancake, Chifley got up, heading to the fridge and pouring a glass of juice for each of them. He kept looking between Sammy and Gille and Missy with a soft, fond smile. There were hints of disbelief in his dark eyes, too.
Sammy eats so much that he feels like he could burst. He looks up as Chifley pours a glass of juice and then grabs his glass. He holds it up, thinking for a moment. To us, all being here, in one piece, he quietly says, holding his glass out to clink it against the others. They had all been through so much, every single one of them, including Missy. And he was so glad they were all here to eat together, to be happy in this moment together. Here, in this moment, the darkness of the past felt far away, where all week it had hung over Sammy like a constricting shroud.
He licked his lips with his forked tongue as he finished up his pancakes, letting out a satisfied He reached up and covered his mouth as he yawned again. Peering through one eye as Chifley placed a glass of juice in front of him. He blinked as he looked up at the blue-haired dude, noticing the touches of disbelief in his eyes. He glanced over at Sammy, wrinkling his eyebrows together as he raised the juice. He shrugged, picking up his own glass and gently tapping it against the taller tunes. I'll drink to that. Gille chuckled, downing the juice like it was a more adult drink. He let out a gasp, slamming the glass down on the wood of the table. He grinned sharply for a moment before yawning again. Reaching up to rub at the dark circles underneath his eyes. He fluttered his eyelashes before pushing back from the table. He rose from his seat, his tail lashing back and forth behind him. I'm tired. I think we should have that nap now. He glanced over toward Chifley and Sammy, a sly smile on his face.
Chifley raised his glass to meet his partner's glasses, gently clinking them together. Me too, Missy insisted, holding hers in both hands. Chifley clinked his glass with hers too, before draining it. He smiled at Gille's suggestion of a nap keenly. He was tired too.
Come on, let's get you two to bed, Sammy said softly after draining his glass. He gathers the plates and cups, placing them in the sink to soak. Missy, if you want, you can grab my art supplies and sketchbook.
Gille pulled a pen out of his pocket and placed it down beside his notebook. He ruffled Missy's hair, leaning over beside her. He whispered in her ear, his expression extremely mischievous. Psst, Missy. If you have anything embarrassing you know about your brother, feel free to draw it in my book if you want. He straightened up again, patting on her shoulder before letting out another yawn. His tail twitched back and forth behind him as he made his way to Chifley's bedroom, crawling onto the bed like he owned it.
Missy just grinned at the devil, giving him a small thumbs up. Chifley didn't notice, helping Sammy tidy the kitchen before heading towards the bed after Gille. He looked over the large bed for a moment and crawled over into the position he had been in earlier, huddled at the head of the bed, back facing the headboard.
Sammy walks in last and crawls into bed, but he doesn't lay down, instead crawling over to Chifley and trying to scoop him up in his arms. But with how Chifley is wedged against the head of the bed, Sammy doesn't want to risk hitting Chifley's back, and instead starts poking him on the side, trying to get him to roll over into the middle. Come on! Cuddle time! I want to hold you, Chif! He's practically whining at this point, pouting at Chifley.
As Chifley looked over the bed, Gille looked up at him, tilting his head to the side, letting his long red hair spill over in front of him. His tail twitched up and down behind him as the blue-haired Toon crawled up near the headboard. He watched as Sammy got pouty, as he narrowed his eyes in a mischievous manner before sitting fully up on the bed. His tail twitched back and forth before he reached forward to grab the blue-haired Toon's arms. He pulled backward, pulling the slightly taller blue-haired Toon on top of him. "There," he said as he laid backwards, sitting his bare feet up on the pillows. He folded his arms behind his head, his tail thumping against the bed beside him.
Chifley let out a slight squeak and went very still where he landed on top of Gille. Eyes very round, blush obvious and vivid.
Sammy's pout morphs into a startled giggle, and he rolls over to wrap his arms around both Gille and Chifley, scooting down to make sure he's not touching either of his partner's spots that could trigger a reaction, and just presses his face into Gille and Chifley's sides with a contented little sigh. He idly considers flipping both Gille and Chifley onto himself, but it's honestly too much effort, and he's comfortable right here. He has both of them in arm's reach and plans to nap the morning away.
Gille let out a short cackle, glancing down at Chifley with the biggest shit-eating grin on his face. He took one of his hands back from holding the blue-haired Toon's arm to reach up and boop his nose. He blinked and looked over at Sammy, curled up beside him, raising an eyebrow with a sigh. He settled in, having pulled Chifley on top of his scar. His eyelashes fluttered against his glasses, reminding him to take them off. He pulled them off his face, folding them in one smooth movement. He shifted a little underneath the slightly taller Toon on top of him, slipping the glasses into his dark orange bathrobe's pocket. With that finished, he settled down again, letting one of his hands rest on top of Sammy's hair, the other on top of Chifley's hands. He raised his eyebrows as his eyes started to drift closed again, looking between the other two Toons. "Comfortable?"
Chifley nodded slightly, still somewhat stunned by the sleeping position, but not about to argue. This did keep his back out of reach, he supposed. He rested his head down against Gille, his eyes closing. This was really nice. This was so very nice. A content smile grew across his face and he let out a sigh, starting to doze off, listening to the lovely cello and waltz that surrounded him.
Sammy let out a yawn, rubbing his cheek into Gille's side a little as he sunk further into the tiredness that had been looming all through breakfast. "You're comfy, Gille. Warm, like a campfire. You smell nice. Smoky and flowery, like I'm in a field of lavender." His gold eyes are drifting shut. "Like you lot. Wanna stay with you lot. Have more times like this. This is nice." The scent of wood smoke and lavender is soothing, bringing in a feeling that Sammy immediately associates with home and safe and protection and lulls him to sleep.
The purple devil Toon smiled sleepily at the nod, letting his head lay back down behind him. The weight of Chifley on his chest reminded him of when he had slept in the bathhouse and how he'd woken up with everyone practically on top of him. As the blue-haired Toon laid his head down on top, he could hear the beating of Gille's heart. It started a little fast, before its pace started to slow. Gille turned his head towards Sammy as the taller Toon mumbles, his eyes sliding close as his cymbal made scraping sounds across his horn. Comfy. That's funny. He opened his eyes just slightly as his nemesis continued to ramble, watching the rainbow-haired Toon basically bury himself in his side. He blinked slowly in that sleepy state as Sammy said those words. He slowly moved his hand from on top of Sammy's head to around the back, relaxing in his position. His eyes closed again, and he drifted off to sleep. Small, sleepy mutterings started to come from him.
The strong pulse of Gille's heart lulled Chifley off to sleep quite handily. Their partner was still sleeping when Sammy and Chifley woke up. Both of them could have slept longer, to be honest, though there was only so long a 4-year-old with too much energy could entertain herself. She had done admirably by holding on that long before giving her brother a determined shake. The three frankenali let him sleep, Sammy and Chifley making lunch before just relaxing in Chifley's apartment for the afternoon. Chifley knew that when they eventually had to go back to their own homes, this small apartment was going to feel so empty. But for now, this was perfect. The end.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you all for
We'll see you next time.
Yep, goodbye.
listening.
Bye.
Goodbye.